Iran's own diplomats in Lebanon, operating as alleged IRGC operatives, and Lebanon just put that accusation in writing at the United Nations. Not a leaked intelligence file, not an anonymous tip, a formal government letter, signed, submitted, on the record. And buried inside that letter is a detail that nobody is talking about. A hotel, 6 Iranians, dead, because Lebanon's foreign ministry didn't even know they were there. Iran hadn't told them. Stay with me, because this story goes much deeper than a diplomatic spat. It's May 2026, and the Middle East is at a genuinely pivotal moment. Israel and Lebanon, 2 countries technically still in a state of war, are sitting down in Washington for a second consecutive day of U.S.-facilitated normalization talks. By all accounts, those talks are going better than expected. The U.S. State Department called the atmosphere very positive, even exceeding expectations. That alone would be a headline. But there's a second story running parallel to those talks, one that may ultimately determine whether any agreement actually holds. Lebanon's government filed a sharply worded complaint with the United Nations, arguing that Iran has abused diplomatic immunity by refusing to recall its ambassador after Beirut demanded his expulsion, and by allegedly running what Lebanon characterizes as terrorist activities on its soil. The letter surfaced from late April. It's being described as a precedent-setting move, and it lands at a moment when the stakes in Beirut could not be higher. If you want fast, fact-based analysis on a story this layered and this fast-moving, hit subscribe now, because we're going deep. Let's go back to the letter itself, because it is remarkable. Lebanon's ambassador to the UN, Ahmad Arafa, accused Iran of inserting alleged IRGC operatives into Lebanese territory under the guise of diplomatic activity. He didn't frame this as a suspicion. He framed it as documented interference, a violation of Lebanese sovereignty, and brought it to the highest international body on the planet. The specific legal argument Arafa made cuts straight to the heart of how modern states are supposed to interact. Lebanon argued that Iran is violating the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the foundational global treaty that governs what diplomats can and cannot do on foreign soil. Diplomatic immunity is a cornerstone of international relations. It exists so that ambassadors can do their jobs without fear. Lebanon is saying Iran has weaponized that protection. Arafa wrote that Iran committed unlawful acts in blatant defiance of the decisions of the Government of Lebanon, and that this Iranian conduct constitutes direct and blatant interference in the internal affairs of Lebanon and drags the country into a war it did not choose to become involved in. That last phrase, a war it did not choose. That is not the language of a country softly pushing back. That is a government drawing a line, publicly, formally, and with legal force. Now, here is where the timeline gets significant. This letter was filed in late April. It only recently surfaced. The timing matters because it emerged just as the U.S. was brokering talks between Israel and Lebanon in Washington. State Department spokesman Tommy Pigott confirmed on May 14th and 15th that the U.S. hosted 2 days of what he described as highly productive talks between the two countries, and that the April 16th cessation of hostilities would be extended by 45 days to enable further progress. Read that again. The ceasefire was extended, talks are advancing, and Lebanon simultaneously accused Iran of running covert operatives through its diplomatic mission. These two things are happening at the same time. One is about building peace. The other is about exposing what may be actively undermining it. The letter specifically called out Iran's ambassador to Beirut, Mohammad Reza Sheibani, accusing him of blatant interference in Lebanese affairs. Beirut demanded his expulsion. Iran refused. And Iran's response to that demand, based on the Lebanese complaint, was to simply ignore it. Both the United States and the European Union classify the IRGC as a terrorist organization. So Lebanon is accusing Iran of using its Beirut embassy as a front for a U.S. and EU-designated terrorist force. That is the core of the charge. And it is sitting at the UN in writing right now. What remains unresolved is how the United Nations and the broader international community actually responds to a letter like this, and whether Lebanon's government has the political durability to follow through on the pressure it has applied. 6 Iranians, a hotel in Beirut, Israel struck it. They all died. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Lebanon's own foreign ministry had no idea those men were in the country. Tehran hadn't told Beirut they were there at all. To understand why this story carries so much weight beyond Lebanon's borders, you need to understand the architecture of Iranian influence in the region. For decades, Iran's strategy in the Middle East has not relied primarily on conventional military power. It has relied on proxy networks, armed groups, political allies, intelligence operatives embedded in neighboring governments and societies. Lebanon, through Hezbollah, has been the crown jewel of that strategy. Hezbollah isn't just a militia, it is a state within a state, with seats in Lebanon's parliament, its own military infrastructure, and deep economic networks. What Lebanon's UN letter represents, if it holds, is the Lebanese government attempting to peel itself away from that arrangement, formally, publicly, with documentation. A leading U.S. expert on Lebanon and the Middle East, Walid Faris, told Fox News Digital that many have considered the Lebanese memo to the UN as the start of the Lebanese government change of attitude towards Iran and a sign of escalation by Beirut. But he immediately qualified that assessment. Faris added that while the tone of the letter and its narrative make people feel that there is a government resistance to Iran and Hezbollah, reality is still lesser. So the letter is real, the legal language is sharp, but the political follow-through? That's the open question. Here's the deeper issue. According to Faris, the actual talks in Washington are designed by the Lebanese government to show the Trump administration that the state wants to talk, but not necessarily to reach an agreement that would trigger Hezbollah's wrath. There it is. That is the tightrope Beirut is walking. Signal enough cooperation with Washington to keep diplomatic momentum alive, but don't move so far or so fast that Hezbollah punishes you for it. Is that cynical maneuvering? Or is it the only survivable path for a fragile government trying to function in the shadow of an armed movement with more firepower than the Lebanese army? That is a question observers in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Beirut are all wrestling with right now. Weighing in the comments, do you think Lebanon's government is genuinely breaking from Iran? Or is this letter more about optics than action? On the diplomatic front, Pigott confirmed that a security track will be launched at the Pentagon on May 29th, with military delegations from both Israel and Lebanon, and that negotiations on a political track are set to reconvene on June 2nd and 3rd. Pentagon, military delegations, a political track. That is not the language of preliminary conversations. That is a structured peace framework being assembled, piece by piece, and running underneath all of it, the Iranian question. Because any agreement between Israel and Lebanon that requires Lebanon to genuinely dismantle Hezbollah's military infrastructure will require confronting Iranian influence directly. The UN letter suggests Beirut knows that. Whether Beirut can act on that knowledge is a different matter entirely. Here is the detail buried in the reporting that almost nobody is focusing on. A regional official cited in the article told Fox News Digital that Lebanon argued Iran had not given the Lebanese Foreign Ministry the list of all Iranians in the country, nor details about their whereabouts, and that this is why Israel targeted a hotel in Lebanon where 6 Iranian nationals were staying, all of whom were killed. Think about what that means. Israel had intelligence on those 6 men. Lebanon's own government did not. Because Tehran hadn't disclosed their presence, not to its supposed ally, not to the country hosting them. Iran was running what appear to be covert operatives inside Lebanon while keeping Lebanon's own government in the dark. And when those men died in an Israeli strike, Lebanon's foreign ministry was left to explain deaths it had no knowledge were about to happen, involving people it didn't officially know were there. That is not an alliance. That is occupation wearing a diplomatic badge. Step back from the diplomatic language for a moment. From the UN letters and the State Department readouts and the expert analysis, think about what this situation actually looks like from inside Lebanon. Lebanon is a country that has been pulled apart repeatedly by forces that did not ask for its consent. The civil war, the Syrian occupation, the Israeli invasions, the Hezbollah takeover of the south, the 2006 war, the 2020 port explosion in Beirut, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in recorded history, which leveled entire neighborhoods and killed over 200 people. The economic collapse that followed, which wiped out life savings, shut down banks, and pushed unemployment to staggering levels. And through all of it, Lebanese civilians, Muslims, Christians, Druze, Sunnis, Shia, have carried the weight of decisions made by armed factions and foreign governments that claim to speak for them or claim to protect them without actually consulting them. The IRGC presence described in Lebanon's UN letter is not abstract to the people who live in southern Beirut suburbs or in the Bekaa Valley or in border towns like those near the Blue Line with Israel. These are communities where Iranian-backed Hezbollah has been a physical, visible, daily reality for a generation, where young men were recruited, where Iranian money funded construction projects and hospitals and schools, all carrying the unmistakable political cost of loyalty to Tehran. Faris noted that Tehran is reportedly furious at Lebanon's foreign minister, Youssef Raji, a Christian bloc representative, for what Iran perceives as insufficient solidarity, including Lebanon's decision not to grant Iranians automatic visa waivers. Read between those lines. Iran is angry because Lebanon stopped treating Iranian nationals as automatically welcome. That is a sovereignty question, one Lebanon is apparently now asserting, however cautiously. And Iran's response is fury. For Lebanese Christians living in the south, many of whom never aligned with Hezbollah, some of whom actively resisted it, the news of Lebanon's UN complaint arrived as something rare, a moment when their government appeared to speak for them rather than for the Iranian-backed faction that has controlled so much of the country's political and military reality. The article also references a Christian border town in Lebanon that reportedly survived the recent conflict by defying Hezbollah, a detail that underscores how fractured the internal Lebanese landscape remains. This is not a country that speaks with one voice on Iran. It is a country where communities in the same geographic region have lived under entirely different political realities. The ordinary Lebanese person trying to understand what the UN letter means and whether the Washington talks mean anything is operating with very limited information and very limited trust. They have heard promises before, peace talks before, ceasefires before. What they haven't heard, at least not in recent memory, is their government formally accusing a neighboring power of planting operatives on their soil using diplomatic cover. That is new. Whether it translates into something durable or dissolves back into the usual political fog of Beirut, that is what people are watching. And watching very carefully, because for the families in southern Lebanon who have lived under the flight paths of Israeli surveillance drones and Hezbollah rocket launchers, the question isn't academic, it is immediate. Who actually controls this ground? Who speaks for this country? And will whatever is being negotiated in Washington actually reach the villages that have paid the highest price? Those are questions the UN letter cannot answer, and the talks in Washington cannot answer either, at least not yet. Here is the pressure point to watch. If Lebanon's government continues pushing, if it maintains the position stated in the UN letter, if it doesn't quietly walk back the Vienna Convention argument, if it keeps insisting Iran recall its ambassador, Tehran's response will likely escalate. Hezbollah remains fully armed. The ceasefire is fragile. Iran has demonstrated repeatedly that it does not accept the erosion of influence in Lebanon without a response. And the Lebanon-Israel talks have a hard deadline. The April 16 ceasefire extension runs for 45 days, with the next political track scheduled for June 2nd and 3rd, and the military-to-military security track set to begin at the Pentagon on May 29th. That is a tight window. A lot can break before June 3rd. Zoom out far enough, and what you're watching in Lebanon is actually a test case for a much larger question that has been running through Middle East geopolitics for years. Can Arab governments, real governments, with armies and courts and foreign ministries, actually reassert sovereignty over territory where Iranian proxy networks have embedded themselves? Or has that window closed? The answer, based on Lebanon, is maybe, barely, with enormous difficulty. Faris assessed that the Lebanese government's leaders are not yet where the U.S. and Israel expect them to be, suggesting a significant gap between what Washington wants from Beirut and what Beirut is currently capable of or willing to deliver. That gap matters enormously because the entire architecture of the Israel-Lebanon normalization effort is built on an assumption that Lebanon's government can and will take responsibility for dismantling Hezbollah's military infrastructure along the border in exchange for Israeli withdrawal from territory it currently holds and recognition of Lebanese sovereignty. That is a significant ask. It requires Lebanon to do something no Lebanese government has been able to do since Hezbollah emerged as a military force in the 1980s. And yet, the UN letter exists. The talks in Washington are happening. The ceasefire was extended. A security track between Israeli and Lebanese military officials is being scheduled at the Pentagon. These are not nothing. 2 years ago, a Pentagon security track between Israeli and Lebanese military delegations would have been unthinkable. What Iran is doing, if Lebanon's allegations are accurate, is trying to prevent exactly this kind of normalization from taking hold, not by launching a war directly, but by maintaining leverage inside Lebanon through operatives, through Hezbollah, through the threat of what happens if Beirut strays too far from Tehran's preferred order. The Vienna Convention argument in Lebanon's UN letter is not just a legal maneuver. It is Lebanon trying to create international documentation of what Iran is allegedly doing. It is Beirut trying to build a record, a paper trail, that could, in theory, be used to justify greater international support for Lebanese sovereignty, or to pressure Iran at the UN Security Council, or to give Lebanon's government political cover if it moves further toward a peace agreement with Israel. Whether any of that plays out depends on factors far beyond what is visible today. Iranian nuclear negotiations with the United States are simultaneously in motion. The Strait of Hormuz situation remains unresolved. The broader regional pressure on Iran is substantial. Tehran is dealing with multiple crises at once, which means Iran's capacity to project force and protect its influence in Lebanon may be more constrained right now than at any point in recent years. That is the window Lebanon's government appears to be trying to use. Whether that window stays open long enough, and whether Beirut has the political courage to move through it, that is the story to watch every single day from here forward. The letter at the UN was a beginning, not a resolution, a first move in a confrontation that could reshape Lebanon and Iran's entire regional strategy, or collapse quietly under the weight of Hezbollah's guns and Tehran's pressure. It is genuinely unresolved, and it is moving fast. This story is at an inflection point. The next few weeks, the Pentagon security meeting on May 29th, the political track on June 2nd, will tell us whether what Lebanon started with this UN letter is the beginning of a real shift or a gesture that fades under pressure. What do you think? Is Lebanon's government serious about pushing back against Iran, or is this letter mostly a performance for Washington's benefit? Drop your read in the comments because this conversation matters. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single update as this story develops, because the next move could come at any hour.